Hello, this will be a video lecture on the deep learning portion of the Beyond the Classroom study plan. The deep learning section begins by discussing Dr. Ken Bain's book, What the Best College Students Do. The study plan uses a discussion of Bain's classification of learners to help us identify our learning habits and how close to or far from learning deeply we are. There is the surface learner, the strategic learner, and the deep learner. The surface learner is the learner who is doing as little as possible to get by. This is the person who's got C's and D's, just enough to pass, but doesn't necessarily feel driven to do any better. After that, there is the strategic learner. Oftentimes, this is the learner who has mastered the process of doing very well on tests without necessarily internalizing the subject matter any better. Finally, there's the deep learner, and this is the learner who is motivated by their passions and who develops a close personal connection to their studies. This person's ability to master the subject matter comes from their desire to want to be able to use it both in the course and their college education, but then after that in the rest of their life as well. The next thing that our study plan does is work to bust some study myths, and I think that actually of all of the content in this study plan, this is one of the most important bits. The first of the study myths that gets busted here is the idea that talent is everything. The problem is this: if we believe that talent is everything, this leaves no room whatsoever for the development of skills. Believing this would mean that there is no progress to be made in any class, and the test grade we get in week 1 would be the exact same as the test grade in week 15. This goes against common sense. If we think about it that way, of course, eventually we would be able to progress through our study skills as we progress through the course. The longer we're in the course, the more careful we are to study for the course subject matter, the better those study skills will get. Speaking of the development of study skills, the next study myth that's busted here is the idea that one only needs one good method for studying, or one studying trick. The issue here is that study methods have to change by the learner, by the subject, by the task, and even by the moment. No one studying method is good for every single thing you have to study for. The subject matter, the format that it's presented in, and the format of the exam itself should all be things that we use as ways of deciding exactly how to go about studying. The next myth to be busted is actually one of the ones that I think is the most important for all of us to understand. And again, this is a myth. This isn't a statement of how things actually work. It's the idea that if it feels easy, we must be learning. The issue here is that if it's easy to understand subject matter, it's because we probably already knew it somehow, or we understood something that's very similar to what's being presented to us. When the subject matter that we're being presented with is actually new and is actually higher level, this is by default subject matter we will struggle with. But the good news is that the more we struggle, the more deeply we learn. That's the important thing to remember here. Ultimately, the learning that we retain the best and benefit from the most is always the most difficult. The more work we do with it, the better we understand it through and through. The opposite is also true. Usually, the less effort one puts in, the more surface level the learning is. Again, this is the reason that this myth is so dangerous. We would think that if we easily understand things, we must be understanding them well, and that's not always the case. Ultimately, if it feels easy, it usually means that we're actually just at the beginning of the learning process. We haven't really progressed very far through it. The next of the study myths that are busted here is the idea that planning is a waste of time and we'll simply do our academic work as we get the chance to. I know that I've said often throughout our class that being able to budget time is a lot like being able to budget money, and it is here that that analogy holds true. Thinking that planning is a waste of the time is the same thing as thinking, well, I don't really have to have a budget. I can just spend my money in a way that seems smart at the moment. It's almost impossible to make a smart expenditure of money or time moment to moment. We always need to see the bigger picture so we know where all the time or money in the analogy is actually going. Ultimately, not planning is the waste of time. Without planning one's time, there's no way of using that time carefully and intentionally. Now, another study myth that a lot of us hold, I think, is the idea that failure should be avoided at all costs. And this is a direct result of the way that we have been taught and the way that we've been rewarded for our academic performance all through school. We've always been the most praised, we've always been given the most rewards for doing well. And the opposite's also been the case. I think oftentimes we've all been a little bit worried to bring home that test or report card with really low grades on it. The issue here is that it starts to teach that knowing the subject matter simply means getting the best grade on it, and that failing must somehow be wrong. That's really far from the truth. Failure provides the learner with a chance to think critically and then rethink and relearn subject matter, and that's always a good thing. There's a difference ultimately between failing and being wrong. Being wrong pertains to matters of factuality, and accuracy, where failing has to do with the way that one carries out the higher order functions from Bloom's taxonomy. That is to say, failing has to do with the way that one creates based on one's facility with the subject matter. Just because one creation doesn't work perfectly doesn't mean there can't be others. In fact, it gives us the important opportunity to try other creations based on our understanding. After that, there are some other useful study techniques that are offered, and I do recommend going through these and reading them yourselves, but just to mention them so you know what they are and where they are. These are techniques like knowing real-world applications for things that we're studying, being able to self-assess so we have a good understanding of what we know versus what we don't know yet, and consequently what we need to continue studying. Another of these study techniques is seeking specific and meaningful feedback. If we do some studying and then go see an instructor, we want to make sure that we've got those questions that we know we want to ask for that meaningful, specific feedback. We need to set priorities. We need to be able to self-assess well enough to know what subjects and parts of subjects we already understand. That way we know that we've got to spend more time in working with other parts of the subject. We need to be able to associate points with each other through either maps, like the sorts of webs I'm sure we've all drawn before, or other conceptual connections so that we can at least see the way that the ideas relate to each other. And finally, we need to try to overcome bias wherever possible. This is a good studying technique because it leads us to see the multiple sides of any point or debate or subject where that might be relevant, and in that way we get to see more parts of it and understand it more deeply again. The last and important... Sorry about that, I thought I heard my name being called. A last and just as important point that's being made in the study plan is the idea of group work. And really, I think that we're best to address this in terms of why we dislike it so much. Think about the way that the tips for getting the most out of group work actually help deal with how little we like doing it. Firstly, it makes sense to acknowledge that to be in a group is anxious. It means placing some of your responsibility for your grade in others' hands. But this is a really good thing. It means that at the very beginning, we have to discuss with our group mates what our expectations are, what our needs are, and the responsibilities that we all have with each other. Working in groups can allow each member to really play to his or her strengths, again, as long as we're talking through what those strengths are and what each member of the group will be doing. True collaborative work is often more than the sum of its parts. The better we can play off each other's strengths, it's almost exponential, in fact, how much better we get to know the subject matter we're working with. Finally, doing group work actually foregrounds one's skills in effective communication, mutual understanding, flexibility, organization, and leadership. And all these are very important things to take forward with us.